When a power-hungry HOA president tries to break into their home with a fake master key, a father and his savvy teenage son turn the tables, using cameras, documents, and a relentless pursuit of truth to expose her reign of suburban tyranny. It was 6:43 in the morning when I heard the jangle of metal outside my front door. A sound too mechanical and deliberate to be innocent. I thought perhaps it was the breeze nudging the tools I'd left hanging on the porch. But then came the click of a key sliding into my deadbolt, followed by the unmistakable rattle of someone twisting a knob that wasn't theirs. My dog stayed silent. My son didn't stir. But I stood frozen halfway between the kitchen and the hall, coffee mug midair, as the sound of a second failed twist echoed again. And then came the voice. It was Karen's voice, shrill and self-important, huffing into the morning as if she owned the air itself. You could hear the sputtering disbelief in her tone when she shouted, "Why doesn't this key work? I have the master key. This is supposed to work." I didn't go to the door. I didn't shout. I just turned slowly and saw my 15-year-old son, Eli, already on the couch, phone to his ear, mouthing the words, "She's trying to break in," as he calmly described everything to the 911 dispatcher. His eyes met mine. He shrugged like this was routine, which sadly it nearly was. The last time she'd tried something this bold, she'd accused us of illegal patio positioning and snapped pictures of our lawn furniture. But this was another level. She was attempting to break in, and when she failed, she didn't walk away. She called 911 herself. I kid you not. I heard her say the words with my own ears, "I have reason to believe someone's illegally occupying this house, and I demand police backup." While she was frantically giving a false report, she didn't realize the dispatcher on the other end of her line was already on the phone with Eli. Hearing both stories unfold in real time with completely opposite narratives, that's when I knew the universe had finally set the stage for justice, and all I had to do was press play. I stepped back quietly and let the drama escalate naturally. Karen was pacing outside like a mall cop in a power fantasy, still gripping that shiny silver key, the so-called master HOA key she claimed gave her access to every home in the community, even though legally she had no such authority. She had printed it on HOA letterhead and laminated it herself. I'd seen it before at a board meeting where she waved it around like it was the sort of property righteousness. My home wasn't part of the HOA anymore. I'd opted out last year after they tried to fine me for a non-regulation wind chime. But Karen never accepted that reality. To her, I was a rogue element living just beyond the reach of her jurisdictional empire. She craved order, uniformity, predictability. I wanted to water my plants in peace without someone threatening to cite me for aggressive basil growth. Eli hung up the phone and looked at me. "They're sending Officer Daniels again," he said with a smirk. The same officer who'd been to 3 previous HOA misfires, all instigated by Karen's pathological obsession with neighbor compliance. You'd think she was bored, but no, Karen lived for these moments. She wasn't just the HOA president. She was a one-woman drama machine fueled by coffee, control, and paranoia. By the time the squad car pulled into the driveway, Karen had planted herself like a misplaced garden statue near my porch, giving commentary to anyone who would listen, or in this case, no one. Officer Daniels stepped out, sunglasses halfway down his nose, looking like a man who had seen enough nonsense for 10 lifetimes. Karen rushed to him. Her words came out fast, breathy, accusatory. "Someone's inside," she hissed. "They won't open the door. I used my master key, and it didn't work. I think someone's squatting." Daniels didn't say much. He turned to me as I opened the door with a calm hand and nodded politely. "Morning. We've had a report of possible trespassing," he said. Eli followed behind me, holding his phone with the video app still open. "Officer Daniels," he said, "this is the audio recording of her trying to unlock our door. You can hear the key scraping, the knob turning, and her calling 911 after it didn't work. We live here. You've met us before." Daniel's eyes turned to Karen and asked the question I'd been waiting for. "Why do you have a key to this house, Karen? And why do you think you're allowed to use it?" Her face flushed instantly, like someone caught shoplifting mood lighting at a furniture store. She stammered something about emergency access and community oversight, but Daniels held up his hand to cut her off. Ma'am, do you have a legal warrant, lease authority, or any proof this house is under your management? She blinked. I could practically see her mental filing cabinet of justifications slamming shut one drawer at a time. Eli walked down the steps and handed Officer Daniels a folder. My son had printed copies of the property deed, the HOA withdrawal letter from last year, and even a notarized statement from our lawyer affirming our independence from the HOA. Karen tried to peer over his shoulder like a raccoon sniffing for dropped fries. Daniels looked it over and nodded. This checks out. You've got no legal reason to be here, Karen. I'm going to have to write up a report for attempted unauthorized entry and a false emergency call. Her jaw dropped so fast I thought she might dislocate something. But I was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe, she stammered. Daniels gave her a long, tired look. From what? A father and his son eating breakfast behind a locked door? Karen backed away slowly, as if reversing her physical presence would somehow erase the reality of what just happened. She muttered something under her breath about bringing this up with the full HOA board, then spun on her heel and marched off in a huff. Her car door slammed like a judge's gavel. Daniels tucked the report folder under his arm and looked at me. Sorry you had to deal with that again. Might be time to talk to the HOA legal team directly. I nodded. Oh, don't worry. That's coming. Eli chuckled. We've got plans. He didn't say what those plans were, and I didn't ask. But I knew my son. He was already 10 steps ahead of her. As Daniels pulled away, and the sun finally began warming the front steps, I felt something shift. Not fear, not frustration, but anticipation. Karen had crossed a line this time, and she didn't know it yet, but she had just opened a door that would only lock behind her once and for all. The quiet that followed Karen's failed stunt didn't last long. I knew her well enough by now to expect that silence from her meant not retreat, but regrouping. And sure enough, 2 days later, a manila envelope arrived at our doorstep without a stamp or address, just a slanted, all-caps note scrawled across the front that read, "For your records." Eli picked it up with a pencil like it might be laced with anthrax and handed it to me with a smirk. I opened it cautiously, half expecting a formal apology, though I should have known better. Instead, it was a thick printout of HOA guidelines and a photocopy of a so-called emergency access clause highlighted in neon yellow. Karen had underlined several lines with a red pen and circled a particular phrase about preserving the security of communal dwellings. Eli read over my shoulder in deadpan, "She really thinks our house is communal property." I shook my head and chuckled, already dialing Janine. She was once Karen's right hand on the HOA board, but that ended after Karen accused her of misallocating the community garden budget to buy organic kale seeds from her cousin. Ever since, Janine had drifted into our orbit, silently rooting for our side. When she answered the phone, I asked if I could come by to talk. She didn't hesitate. Her exact words were, "If this is about her trying to break into your house like it's The Sims, I've got something for you." I drove to her place that afternoon. Janine lived 2 streets over in a house that looked like it belonged in a coffee commercial, all soft blue shutters and rose trellises. She met me at the porch with a mischievous smile and waved me inside. Her living room was filled with neatly labeled binders that lined an entire bookshelf like trophies. She poured us tea without asking and pointed to the 3rd shelf from the top. "Pick any binder from the red section," she said. I pulled one marked HOA Emergency Access Protocols 2012 to 2023. Inside were years' worth of meeting notes, recorded votes, and amendments, all carefully tabbed and color-coded. Janine leaned in. "You're not going to believe how many times she's tried this master key stunt." Turns out Karen had been attempting variations of her power move for years. According to the minutes, she had proposed at least 6 different times to give herself authority to access homes for vague emergencies, ranging from water leaks to aura inconsistencies. Each time, the motion was denied or tabled. The board never formally approved her key privileges, and most members didn't even know she had one. Janine pulled out her phone and showed me a photo she took at a board meeting last year, Karen proudly holding up a ring of keys and explaining how she had duplicates made just in case. The photo even had a timestamp and board member reactions scribbled in the margins. "Eli's going to love this," I said. Janine winked. That's not all. She handed me another folder, this one thinner but far more potent. It contained email exchanges between Karen and a locksmith company. The subject line on one message read, "Urgent HOA key copy job," and the body asked for 10 spare copies to be made based on a mold she provided. The email was dated 3 weeks before she tried to enter our house. The pieces clicked fast. She wasn't just acting on impulse. She had a system, a method, and probably a whole drawer of unauthorized keys. I thanked Janine and promised to keep her name out of anything official. She waved me off. "Just bring her down a notch," she said. "For all of us." Back home, Eli had already created a shared folder labeled Karen Ops, filled with surveillance screenshots, audio clips, and community forum posts where Karen tried to smear my name for everything from noise violations to solar panel glare harassment. He looked up as I walked in and said, "I added a new section called History of Abuse." We dropped the binder scans and the locksmith emails into the folder and backed it up twice. I didn't know what we'd do with it yet, but it felt like stockpiling fuel. And when Karen lit the next match, we'd be ready. It came sooner than expected. That weekend, as I was trimming the ivy near the fence line, Karen rolled up in her beige SUV with the same sense of authority she always had, like she was a federal agent checking for smuggled begonias. She stepped out in heels, clipboard in hand, and began inspecting my side yard like she was preparing for an open house. I didn't speak, I just watched. She scribbled something on her form and took out her phone to snap a photo of my patio set. Then she waved the clipboard in my direction and shouted across the yard, "Your patio chairs are non-compliant. You need HOA approval for any outdoor structure larger than 24 inches in height." I stared at her, then at my $39 folding lawn chairs, then back at her. "You mean these?" I asked. "The ones I bought at the grocery store?" She nodded sharply. "There's a process," she said. "A form, a waiting period. You can't just decorate willy-nilly." Eli appeared behind me with his phone out again, already filming. Karen turned to him and scowled. "You don't have permission to record me," she snapped. He shrugged. "We're on our property." "You're not. That's how this works, remember?" Right on cue, Officer Daniels pulled into the cul-de-sac. He had barely stepped out before Karen marched up and declared that we were violating HOA landscaping regulations. Daniels looked at the chairs, looked at me, and then turned to Karen with a sigh. "Are you honestly calling me out here for patio furniture?" Karen's face went tight. "It's the principle," she said. Daniels walked toward the house, looked at Eli, and nodded toward the phone. "You recording again?" Eli nodded. "Good," Daniels said. "This is the only thing keeping me sane." He pulled out his notepad and turned to Karen. "You're being documented for repeated misuse of emergency dispatch again, and we're putting this on record with the city liaison." Karen's mouth twitched. She opened it to argue but shut it again when she saw Eli zooming in on her face. Without another word, she turned, stomped back to her SUV, and left tire marks in the gravel as she peeled away. Daniels glanced at me. "You know, there are ordinances for harassment via property intimidation." I looked at him. "Think it'll hold?" He nodded. "Especially if you build a timeline." I nodded back. "Timeline's already under construction." That night, Eli uploaded the newest footage to the folder and created a subfolder titled Public Overreach. We didn't just have video. We had a story forming, a timeline of escalation, a paper trail of audacity. Eli looked at the screen and said what I was thinking. "She keeps thinking no one's paying attention, but we are. And this time we're going to use her own obsession with rules to bury her in them." I stood behind him, watching the footage loop, Karen with her clipboard, Karen with her key, Karen with her calls, and all the while the law watching silently from a body cam and a kid with a phone doing more legal work than most interns. We weren't in a war. We were in a slow, deliberate chess match. And Karen had just moved her queen one square too far. It was a Thursday afternoon when the next round of Karen's campaign arrived in the form of a fake smile and a not-so-subtle clipboard tucked under her arm like a weapon she didn't know how to use properly. I was in the backyard organizing the tool shed when I heard her heels clicking against the gravel of the side path. And without even turning around, I knew it was her. There was a distinct rhythm to her footsteps, urgent and self-important, like every stride she took was part of some silent power walk to reclaim what she imagined was hers. Eli, who was supposed to be inside doing homework, had already seen her coming and was standing in the upstairs window with a phone in one hand and a walkie-talkie in the other. He pressed the talk button and said, "She's coming around the side like she owns the place again," and I calmly responded with a copy that made him chuckle from the second floor. I didn't even have to ask if he was recording. By now, he had automated the entire process, syncing the backyard motion sensor with his live stream app so that any uninvited guest showing up on our perimeter triggered the cameras and alerted the cloud drive. Karen's image was already being uploaded to 3 separate devices before she even reached the gate. She didn't knock. She didn't call out. She simply reached over the wooden fence and unlatched the side gate as if she were a relative coming over to borrow sugar. And the moment she stepped inside the yard, Eli zoomed in with surgical precision. Karen spotted him just as he panned the camera down to her clipboard. She froze mid-step, caught between confrontation and pretending everything was normal. I turned from the shed and gave her a smile so blank it might as well have been printed on cardboard. "Good afternoon," I said, though it didn't sound like a greeting so much as an opening line in a chess game. She tilted her chin up and said, "I'm conducting a routine HOA compliance walkthrough, and I need to document certain backyard irregularities." I nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in disbelief at her audacity. I reminded her again that we had withdrawn from the HOA the previous year and that our property was legally outside her jurisdiction. She responded by reading a paragraph from the clipboard like it was scripture, misquoting bylaws and referencing codes that didn't even exist in the version of the documents we had archived. When I politely asked her to leave, she raised her voice just enough to trigger the porch mic and said, "You're obstructing an HOA official from fulfilling her duties, and this is being recorded for the board." Eli's voice crackled through the walkie again, this time to say, "Yeah, well, so is yours, and it's being recorded for the internet." Karen turned crimson but held her ground, squinting at Eli with the kind of disdain usually reserved for people who let their hedges grow a half-inch too tall. She pointed at a set of patio umbrellas in our backyard and said, "Those are structurally oversized and pose a wind hazard." I blinked. Wind hazard. I asked her if she had an anemometer tucked into her purse or if she was just using her instincts today. She didn't laugh. She scribbled something and began snapping pictures of everything from the bird feeder to the ceramic gnome that Eli had named Judge McGrumpy and placed near the garden hose out of pure irony. As she rounded the patio, still pretending to be on some kind of official mission, she stepped right into a puddle Eli had created an hour earlier while refilling the fountain. The splash hit her shoes, and she let out a gasp like someone had sprayed her with mace. "That's it," she shouted. "I'm calling for an emergency compliance officer. This entire yard is a liability." By the time she pulled out her phone to dial the same non-emergency number she always called, Officer Daniels was already turning onto the street. It was the 5th time in 3 months he had responded to one of Karen's unsolicited inspections. And judging by the slow roll of his cruiser and the exaggerated slouch in his posture as he stepped out, he was not thrilled to be back. Karen greeted him with a dramatic retelling of her wet shoe incident and waved her clipboard like a magician revealing a cursed artifact. She claimed that we had violated at least 5 safety codes, endangered community aesthetics, and failed to report a possibly illegal lawn ornament. Daniels looked past her at Judge McGrumpy, who was missing one eye and leaning sideways like he'd been in a bar fight, and then looked back at Karen with deadpan amusement. He walked over to me and asked if we were still technically independent of the HOA, and I handed him the folder we now kept by the grill labeled "In Case of Karen." He thumbed through the pages, nodded, and asked if we had video of her entering the yard. Eli held up his phone without saying a word, and Daniels said, "That's good enough for me." He turned back to Karen and asked what authority she had to enter private property without permission. She sputtered something about community oversight again, repeating the same talking points as last time, like they would gain legal weight through repetition. Daniels held up a hand and said, "Karen, trespassing is trespassing, whether you call it a walkthrough or a parade. You don't get to enforce HOA codes on homes that aren't even under your control." Her mouth opened, closed, then opened again, and the only thing that came out was an angry huff as she tried to salvage what little dignity she thought she had. I could see the gears spinning behind her eyes, trying to recalibrate her next move. But Daniels wasn't done. He pulled out his notepad and asked her for a list of all the properties she'd conducted inspections on in the past 6 months. Karen froze, her clipboard clutched tighter. She tried to protest, saying the records were confidential, but Daniels was already calling it in for an official complaint review. That's when Eli, without a hint of sarcasm, asked Officer Daniels if he'd like to join our private Dropbox folder titled HOA Overreach, where we stored all footage, transcripts, and questionable incidents tied to Karen's activities. Daniels, to his credit, said yes. He gave us his city email and said, "Forward it all. Every file, every video, every instance." The moment Karen heard that, she turned without another word and made her exit, her heel slapping angrily against the pavement as if blaming the ground for her missteps. As she disappeared down the street, Daniel shook his head and said, "If she tries this again, we'll escalate it to the HOA legal mediator and the city code board. She's not above accountability." I thanked him as Eli nodded approvingly, already organizing files for the email drop. Back inside, the atmosphere was lighter, almost celebratory. Eli began splicing footage together, adding timestamps and organizing it by incident type. We had video of the gate latch being opened without permission, audio of her declaring her fake authority, and high-res images of her clipboard scribbles. I brewed coffee while he edited. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a real shift. We weren't just reacting anymore. We were documenting, exposing, defending. We were building something unshakable, a case not just against Karen, but against the culture she'd built, one of fear and control, disguised as community care. The following week brought with it the long-awaited HOA town hall meeting, the kind Karen typically weaponized to her advantage with scripted outrage, strategically printed bylaws, and a vocal group of hand-picked loyalists who either feared her or genuinely believed she was some sort of suburban prophet sent to protect the sanctity of matching mailboxes and synchronized trash bin placement. I hadn't planned to attend. I'd stayed away from those meetings ever since pulling out of the HOA. And truthfully, I had no desire to sit in a folding chair under fluorescent lights while Karen lectured the room about garden gnome overpopulation or rogue wind chimes. But Janine called the night before and said 2 words that changed everything: bring footage. Apparently, the board had been quietly collecting complaints. A few homeowners had finally grown tired of Karen's random citations, surprise inspections, and obsessive documentation. Some were fed up with her 911 theatrics. One elderly neighbor had even received a warning for leaving a planter too close to his stairs. Janine said tonight's meeting might be more than just community updates and finger-pointing. There was a real chance, she whispered, that Karen might be challenged for her seat as HOA president. It was a small chance, but real enough for me to charge every camera battery we own and back up our files twice before bed. Eli was practically vibrating with anticipation. He wore a shirt with a pixelated judge's gavel on it and packed a hard drive labeled Operation Karen. He even prepared a short presentation complete with timestamps, incident summaries, and clips stitched together like a legal documentary. I didn't have the heart to tell him it was probably overkill. I admired the way he approached it, calm and surgical, not just with a thirst for revenge, but a clear vision for justice and boundaries. We arrived early, took our seats near the back, and waited as the room filled with faces we recognized from dog walks, garage sales, and lawnmower noises on Sunday mornings. Karen arrived last, of course, entering with the same smug energy as always, carrying her oversized binder like it contained the Constitution. She wore a blazer over a floral blouse and gave nods to her allies, who all sat near the front like well-rehearsed jurors. The meeting began with roll call, followed by boring updates about irrigation repairs and mailbox locks. And then, as expected, Karen launched into her self-aggrandizing report. She spoke about neighborhood safety, cited imaginary statistics about increased trespassing, and casually mentioned her recent efforts to ensure compliance with emergency key access policies. She left out the part where she tried to break into our house. She left out the part where she slipped in our backyard, called 911 3 times in a month, and earned a citation from Officer Daniels. But before she could get to the next bullet point on her agenda, Janine raised her hand. With a calm voice and steady posture, she asked the board if she could submit a motion for discussion before Karen moved on. The room shifted. Karen's eyes narrowed. Janine stood and said, "I'd like to propose a public review of the recent unauthorized compliance inspections carried out by the president without proper board approval." That one sentence cracked the veneer of control Karen had built around herself like a porcelain wall. She stammered something about standard procedures and emergency clauses, but Janine countered by citing exact dates and meeting minutes, including ones we had copied for our archive. Eli, to my surprise, stood next to her and introduced himself to the board formally, stating his full name and that he lived at my address. Then, with a short nod from Janine, he walked over to the projector and plugged in his drive. What happened next wasn't dramatic in volume, but in precision. He played the footage from the morning Karen tried to unlock our front door with her fake master key. You could hear her voice clearly, "I have authority to enter." You could hear her admit to using a key. You could hear her say she was calling 911 because she believed someone was illegally occupying our home. Then Eli switched clips and showed the body cam footage of Officer Daniels questioning her. Then a few seconds of her walking into our backyard, clipboard raised, trespassing again. He ended with the footage of her yelling about patio umbrellas and declaring our gnome a safety hazard. The room was silent when he finished, not shocked, not angry, just quiet in the way people get when they're recalculating everything they thought they knew about someone. Karen broke first. She jumped up and said this was all taken out of context, that it was illegal to film people without their permission, that none of this was valid because we weren't even part of the HOA anymore. But Janine calmly responded that every single instance shown occurred either on public record, private property, or within clear legal rights of self-documentation. She added that repeated misuse of emergency services was not just a nuisance, but a legal liability for the entire community. Then a man in the front row stood up and asked how many times Karen had entered someone's yard without notice. Another woman asked why her husband received a citation for an unpainted shed door when their property was technically grandfathered in under the old rules. Then someone else asked how many times Karen had acted alone, claiming board authority without actually consulting the board. Karen began to unravel, her voice rising, her words falling over each other like dominoes stacked too high. She flipped through her binder, pointing to pages as if they proved something. But her allies looked away, uncertain now, unsure whether the ship was still floating or already taking on water. A board member named Stewart, who'd previously nodded along with Karen's reports, finally spoke up and said, "I think we need to pause this meeting and have a closed session to discuss these incidents." Karen tried to protest, but it was too late. The vote was called. Hands went up, not just from the board, but from the community members who had sat in silence for years, tolerating her rule out of convenience or fatigue. Eli leaned over and whispered, "Checkmate," and I nearly laughed, but all I did was place a hand on his shoulder and nod. The meeting was recessed, and Karen stormed out, her binder flapping open as she pushed past chairs, muttering about lawsuits and betrayal. No one followed her. Janine exhaled, looked over at us, and said, "That went better than I expected." Eli, ever the tactician, handed her a flash drive with all the materials, time-stamped and indexed, and said, "If you ever need more, we've got backups." On the way home, we didn't talk much. The silence was comfortable, like the deep inhale after a storm passes, and you realize your roof held steady. It wasn't over. Karen would retaliate somehow. Her ego was too large to let this be the final word. But for the first time, she didn't own the narrative. She didn't get to twist the facts or weaponize protocol. The community had seen her clearly. And once people see truth framed that plainly, it's hard to pretend blindness again. We pulled into the driveway, headlights brushing over the gnome, still standing crooked near the hose. I left him there deliberately, like a tiny sentinel guarding against nonsense. As we stepped inside and locked the door, I felt the smallest shift in the air, not victory exactly, but momentum. And with Karen off balance, that was more than enough. By the time the dust settled from the town hall meeting and Karen's thunderous exit faded into the cool evening air, a strange calm blanketed the neighborhood. It was that deceptive kind of calm, the eerie stillness before a storm doubles back after pretending it's past. And sure enough, it only took 4 days for Karen to strike again. This time, her move was more veiled, more bureaucratic, and far more underhanded than we expected. No clipboards, no screeching accusations, no HOA-branded drive-by patrols. Instead, I received a folded letter taped to my front door, the kind printed on cheap inkjet paper pretending to be official. The header read County Zoning Compliance Inquiry, but the formatting was off, and the text alignment reeked of amateur forgery. Inside, the letter accused me of violating structural code through an illegal expansion of our deck and patio area, citing a complaint submitted anonymously. Eli and I looked at it together at the kitchen table, and neither of us needed to say it out loud. We knew exactly who had filed it. I even recognized the clunky wording Karen had used before in HOA emails, phrases like improper extension perimeter and suspicious construction activity. It was almost charming how predictable she was until you remembered she had enough time, pettiness, and delusion to weaponize local government channels to make her revenge feel official. But the twist this time was she didn't stop at filing. She'd gone a step further and sent in doctored photos, side-by-side comparisons of our backyard with another property, making it look like we'd added over 6 feet of decking in a restricted zone. She had even highlighted the grass line with crude red arrows to imply boundary violations. It was objectively an embarrassing attempt, but it had triggered a county inspection nonetheless, and that meant someone from the actual zoning office would be coming by in the next 48 hours. Eli barely blinked. He set down the letter, cracked his knuckles, and said, "Well, I guess it's time for the GIS files." I had no idea what he meant until he explained that for a school project 2 months earlier, he had mapped out the entire community's zoning grid using open-source GIS software and overlaid it with satellite imagery from the last 5 years. He'd compiled property lines, permit history, and time-stamped images that could validate structural changes or disprove them with pixel-level precision. He said it like he was talking about a video game, completely unfazed, as though this was just another side quest in a longer campaign. The inspector arrived 2 days later, clipboard in hand, neutral expression on her face. Her name was Miss Pratt, a no-nonsense professional with sensible shoes and a gaze that said she'd seen too many angry neighbors yelling about fence height. She didn't come with accusations, only questions. She asked if she could take a few photos and measure the deck. I said, of course. Eli appeared from inside holding a folder thicker than her clipboard. He introduced himself politely, then opened to a printed page with our original deck plans, the contractor's permit, and 2 years' worth of maintenance receipts. Ms. Pratt flipped through them without a word. Then Eli showed her his GIS overlays, a series of time-stamped satellite images that proved our deck hadn't changed since it was built. He even zoomed in on seasonal shadows to demonstrate how the light cast from the pergola structure had remained identical across all photos. Ms. Pratt blinked, glanced between Eli and the folder, and said, "This is more documentation than I've ever received from a homeowner in 15 years. Eli nodded. Karen's a repeat offender. We stay ready. Ms. Pratt jotted some notes, marked us as cooperative, and promised to close the complaint with no action needed. Then, almost as an afterthought, she asked if we knew of anyone in the community who might have a history of filing questionable complaints. Eli didn't even hesitate. He handed her a sealed envelope labeled HOA pattern reports, which contained summaries of Karen's past 911 calls, trespassing incidents, and her recent town hall exposure. Ms. Pratt didn't say anything. She just slid it into her bag and left with a half-smile that suggested this visit wasn't her first dance with the dark side of neighborhood politics. The following morning, a letter arrived, not from the county, but from Karen, typed and sealed in a pink envelope. It reeked of performative civility. She addressed it to me but clearly wrote it for a broader audience, assuming I might show it around. It was full of passive-aggressive fluff about neighborhood standards and her concern for property value preservation, followed by a paragraph where she expressed hope that I wouldn't retaliate against her for doing her duty as a vigilant citizen. Eli read it aloud in a theatrical voice, adding unnecessary flourishes to her already dramatic sentences. It ended with a final note about grace under pressure and the responsibility of setting an example for future homeowners. I almost framed it out of spite but instead scanned it into the archive folder under the tag Karen Nonsense, Civil Edition. Things could have ended there. She had tried and failed again. Her complaint was denied, her manipulations noted, but Karen didn't know how to walk away. The same day we received her letter, a notice appeared in the community forum announcing a special HOA session regarding emergency powers, public safety clauses, and the potential for temporary restrictions on properties deemed suspicious or non-compliant. It was worded in such vague, law-proof language that only one person could have authored it. The implication was subtle, but the message was clear: Karen wasn't done. She was laying the groundwork for a bigger play, a vote to grant herself retroactive power under the guise of community safety. This wasn't about us anymore. It was about cementing her grip before the board could vote her out. Janine called that evening, furious. She hadn't been consulted about the forum post and said Karen had published it without a vote. Worse, Karen was spreading whispers that Eli and I were planning to sue the HOA and that we were filming residents without consent, building a private lawsuit vault. I was too tired to be surprised. I told Janine we'd be at the meeting, not just as observers this time, but as participants with a presentation ready to go. Eli had already begun preparing the files, grouping them under a new heading: Karen's Campaign of Paranoia. He planned to show the letter, the zoning inspector's findings, the doctored complaint images, and a side-by-side breakdown of the language used in Karen's county report and her HOA forum post. The days leading up to the meeting were quiet. Karen didn't patrol. She didn't call. She didn't appear in our yard, but we knew she was working behind the scenes, organizing her supporters, printing materials, whispering into ears at mailbox clusters and HOA garden walks. The silence wasn't peace. It was strategy. But what she didn't realize, what she never seemed to understand, was that we weren't afraid of exposure. We welcomed it because everything she used to try to scare people, to manipulate, control, and silence, we had documented. And now her strategy was collapsing under the weight of her own paper trail. The special HOA session was scheduled for 7 o'clock sharp. But Eli and I arrived 20 minutes early, not because we expected anything dramatic right away, but because we knew Karen would. She'd always been one to arrive early and stage her presence like a theater production, aligning her papers just so, greeting her chosen loyalists with thin smiles and louder than necessary hellos, then glaring toward any new face as if it were a weed growing between her roses. But this time, the room was different. Chairs had been added to accommodate an unusual turnout. People who hadn't attended a single meeting in years were there, sipping coffee, shifting awkwardly, glancing around as if they'd been summoned by some invisible reckoning. Janine sat near the front, arms folded, and gave us a subtle nod when we walked in. She had already spread out a small folder in front of her and was tapping her pen like a slow drumbeat, waiting for a signal. Karen stood near the podium, pretending to be casual, though her eyes betrayed her. They darted from person to person, calculating, nervous. And then she saw Eli carrying the laptop case, and her entire expression tightened by degrees, the way a curtain slowly drops when someone realizes the show is no longer under their control. The board president, a soft-spoken man named Tom, who usually avoided conflict by mumbling through the agenda, cleared his throat and called the meeting to order. He read the statement of purpose, which, to our amusement, had clearly been rewritten by Karen and approved by no one. It mentioned concerns over community security, the need for flexible enforcement powers, and the exploration of temporary safety designations for homes with a pattern of ambiguous compliance history. It was so obviously designed to target us without saying our names that half the room shifted uncomfortably before the first motion was even raised. Karen stepped up to speak, her voice lined with false concern and smoothed over by rehearsed phrases. She spoke of recent zoning inquiries, property surveillance, and what she described as confusing residency documentation. She never mentioned me or Eli directly, but she gestured toward our side of the room so often that her finger practically became a compass. She cited bylaws inaccurately, leaned into emotional buzzwords like cohesion and safety, and even mentioned that the HOA had an obligation to maintain harmonious residential visibility, whatever that meant. It sounded like she'd read a pamphlet from a dystopian homeowner seminar and copied the vague language onto her note cards. When she finished, there was a moment of silence, the kind that always follows a speech where the audience isn't sure if it's over or if they just didn't understand what was being said. Then Tom cleared his throat again and said, "Before any vote is considered, the floor is open to counterstatements." And that was our cue. Eli stood up, calm, direct, confident. He didn't look at Karen. He didn't raise his voice. He simply walked to the projector table, plugged in his flash drive, and began speaking. He introduced himself, gave our full address, and reminded everyone that our home had formally withdrawn from the HOA 1 year and 2 months prior, which by law excluded us from any enforceable HOA restrictions unless we opted back in, which we had not. Then he began the presentation. Slide 1, a screenshot of the zoning complaint Karen had filed, including the file number, date, and her own email from a public records request. Slide 2, satellite images showing our deck had not changed in size in 5 years. Slide 3, the county inspector's written report dismissing the complaint entirely. Slide 4, a comparison of Karen's report and her online HOA forum post, highlighting matching phrases and timelines. Slide 5, a timeline of emergency service calls made by Karen to our address, with Officer Daniel's incident summaries displayed one by one. The room stayed quiet, but the tension shifted. People began leaning forward. Some whispered, others started taking photos of the screen with their phones. Karen tried to interrupt once, raising her voice and declaring that she was being unfairly attacked, but Tom shut her down politely. "You'll have time for rebuttal after," he said, though his tone made it clear that time was running out for her influence. Eli continued. He played the video of Karen attempting to use the master key on our door. Her voice came through clearly in the recording, saying she had authority to enter. The footage shifted to the body cam where Officer Daniels confronted her. Eli paused and looked at the board. That wasn't a misunderstanding. That was a deliberate violation of personal boundaries and misuse of authority. He explained how her fake emergency inspections had led to a misuse citation and how several neighbors had experienced similar unannounced visits under vague justifications. Janine stood up and confirmed it. Then another neighbor stood. Then a third. Suddenly, a pattern began to emerge, not from our files, but from the voices of the people around us. By the time Eli wrapped up, Karen's face had gone white. She tried again to reclaim the floor, speaking fast, defensive, sputtering phrases about due diligence and neighborhood integrity. But now it sounded hollow. The weight of facts had crushed her performance. Janine stood up again and proposed an immediate vote to formally restrict the HOA president from conducting independent property inspections without board approval and homeowner consent. She also proposed an emergency review of Karen's conduct to determine if her actions violated any ethical or procedural standards as defined in their charter. Tom didn't even hesitate. He looked around the room, saw the faces, many of them people who had never dared to speak before, and asked for a show of hands. More than 2/3 of the room raised them. When the count ended, Karen's status was suspended pending board review. She was asked to step away from HOA activities until the investigation was complete. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply packed up her papers, turned her binder sideways, and walked out of the room without saying a word. It was the quietest exit she'd ever made, no clipped footsteps, no whispered threats, just a silence so complete it felt like a closing door echoing down a long hallway. After she left, people clapped, not loudly, not like a celebration, but like a release of pressure that had built up for years and finally found a valve. Tom thanked everyone and adjourned the meeting, but the buzz in the room lingered long after the gavel tap. Back at home, Eli uploaded the entire meeting to our secure drive. He added a new folder titled Karen's Last Stand and tagged it with keywords like overreach, HOA meltdown, and public exposure. I stood on the porch with a mug of tea and looked across the street at her house. Her porch light was off for the first time in months. Her SUV sat still, no motion, no energy, just the shell of a woman who had built a fortress of rules and found herself crushed beneath their weight. It wasn't over yet. The review process would take weeks, but the illusion was broken. The fear she inspired, the silence she harvested, it had all been replaced with scrutiny and documentation. 2 weeks passed without a single false report, clipboard sighting, or unsolicited footstep on our property. The quiet was so unfamiliar that it almost felt suspicious, as if the silence itself had been sent as a decoy to lull us into letting our guard down. But the reality was far simpler. Karen had vanished. Not literally, her car was still parked in her driveway most days, her porch plants still got watered by what looked like a professionally hired gardener, and her mail disappeared from the box like clockwork. But her presence, the stormy gravitational pull she once carried through every HOA interaction, had evaporated. Her name no longer popped up in the community forums. Her tone no longer echoed through meetings. Her clipboard, once a symbol of unearned authority, had become a punchline. And though the board's formal review of her conduct wasn't scheduled to conclude for another 10 days, everyone knew her influence had already collapsed. Her removal was now a formality, a closing paragraph in a story everyone had grown tired of reading. Eli treated the victory with a calm dignity that most adults couldn't have mustered. He never gloated. He never bragged. He just cleaned up the folder system one last time, archived the videos into an encrypted cloud vault, and renamed the final file Karen_final.mp4 before placing it in a backup drive labeled HOA history. I found him that evening on the porch, feet up, laptop balanced on one knee as he adjusted one of the outdoor cameras. I asked him why he was still updating the system if the threat had passed. And he simply said, because history has a habit of circling back when people forget they recorded it the first time. I smiled and sat down beside him. And for a while, we said nothing at all, letting the wind move past us, soft and without warning. The absence of tension was so refreshing. I didn't realize how long I'd been carrying it in my shoulders, waiting for the next knock, the next letter, the next unwanted photo snapped from the sidewalk. Then, out of nowhere, a certified envelope arrived. It came on a Tuesday morning, hand-delivered by a courier who didn't bother with conversation. I opened it cautiously, half expecting some legal maneuver or veiled threat wrapped in formal language. But it wasn't a lawsuit or a retaliation notice. It was an apology, not handwritten, not heartfelt, but typed in precise legal language from a law office 3 counties over. The letter explained that their client, Karen Monroe, was formally retracting any prior allegations or complaints made against our household, that she would abstain from any further interaction or inspection attempts, and that she acknowledged the unauthorized actions taken regarding access attempts and neighborhood compliance disputes. At the bottom was her signature, notarized. I stared at the page for several minutes, unsure how to interpret it. Eli read over my shoulder and said, "She finally folded," and I nodded, still uncertain whether to believe it, but the details were all there. She was done. As if fate itself wanted to underline the irony, another envelope arrived an hour later. This one from the HOA board. It was a community-wide notice announcing the results of the internal review. Karen Monroe had been officially removed from her position, her access to HOA records and privileges terminated effective immediately. The letter explained that her role would be replaced via a vote at the upcoming seasonal gathering and invited any resident in good standing to apply. I didn't need to read the fine print to know Janine's name would be at the top of that list. There was something poetic in the timing, almost as if the neighborhood had collectively agreed to shed the weight of her governance all at once and move into the next chapter together. That evening, we celebrated in our own quiet way. Eli grilled burgers on the back deck while I repotted a few herbs that had been ignored during the madness. We played music softly, something light and instrumental, and let the calm stretch out long and slow. At one point, Janine stopped by unannounced, carrying a bottle of sparkling cider and a grin that said she hadn't felt this light in years. She joined us on the deck, raised her glass, and simply said, "To peace and perimeter boundaries." We laughed, we toasted, and for once, there was no hidden camera, no transcript to review, no defensive folder at arm's reach, just 3 people sharing a quiet moment without the shadow of a clipboard peeking from the fence line. Later that night, just as the stars began pricking through the sky and the neighborhood turned soft and sleepy, there was a knock at the front door. For a single flicker of a second, my muscles tensed the way they used to, conditioned by months of unexpected confrontation. But Eli checked the porch camera before I could even reach the handle and said, "It's just a delivery." I opened the door to find a package wrapped in brown paper, no return address, just my name written in simple script. Inside was a ceramic gnome identical to the one Karen had once mocked and threatened to find me over, except this one wore tiny sunglasses, carried a miniature clipboard, and held a sign that read "Retired." I held it up and stared at it for a while before laughing so hard I nearly dropped it. No note, no explanation, just that little statue, perfectly timed, perfectly ironic. Eli was convinced Janine had sent it, but she denied everything. Regardless of who did, it earned a place of honor on the front step, standing guard by the door she once tried to open with a master key that never should have existed. From then on, our home was truly ours again. The cameras remained, the folders stayed backed up, but the tension dissolved, replaced by a steady rhythm of calm days, quiet evenings, and neighbors who waved instead of whispered. Karen still lived across the street, but her blinds stayed drawn more often, her walks shorter, her presence more spectral than real. She had become a reminder rather than a threat, a lesson in how power borrowed without consent always collapses under scrutiny. Occasionally, people in the neighborhood would still mention her, mostly in passing, usually with a laugh. But her chapter had ended, not in dramatic legal battle or explosive confrontation, but in the slow erosion of credibility and the unshakable presence of truth, preserved in video clips, timestamps, and calm voices that refused to be intimidated. Eli eventually turned his compilation footage into a short film for a school media project, anonymized and trimmed for privacy. He called it The Gatekeeper and won first prize at the county level. His teacher sent a note home saying it was one of the most detailed pieces of storytelling she'd ever seen and asked for permission to share it in next year's curriculum on digital literacy and civil rights. He was humble about it as always, but I could see the pride in his eyes. He hadn't just stood up to someone. He documented, defended, and dismantled their illusion of authority through reason and patience. And in doing so, he gave voice to people who had been silently bullied for years.